Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Thank you for joining us for another of our TenX Strategies Going Big webinars, where we dig into the weeds a bit about some particular fundraising strategies and tactics that can help you advance your mission much more effectively by having a lot more resources to help you fund your cause. And I'm so pleased to have with us today Ann Fitzgerald. I know she is well known to many of you who are joining today. Ann has worked professionally in the nonprofit development space for a number of years. She has her own firm, which is extremely well regarded and continues to help so many good causes with their work. We're going to dive in today to talk about how to plan for the new year. We've talked a lot recently in webinars about how to handle the end of year and how it's important to begin so many of those efforts at least as early as October. We heard from John Davis at the Leadership Institute and Nathan Hill from Next After and David Reidenauer from the National Center for Public Policy Research about different approaches with respect to direct mail donors, with online donors, how to prepare for that outpouring of generosity that happens in the last 45 days of the year. But there's a lot that happens in January and February, not just in terms of giving, but by giving decisions. And so that's why I wanted to have Ann Fitzgerald on. Ann really focuses on helping groups become much more strategic about their fundraising. And that's why I really wanted to have you. Ann, welcome. It's great to have
Thank
you.
you.
I'm just going
Delighted to be here.
Oh, it's great to have you. I'm just going to kick off by asking, why is it so important to think strategically about the beginning of the year fundraising here in October?
Right. Good question. And I totally understand where nonprofits are right now. There's like, we have so much to do before year end. How can we even put any attention or thought into January? But when I reflect on this, part of the challenge is sort of what you mentioned, is that for most organizations, they get as much as 60% of all major gifts in the last quarter of the year. Different statistics, but certainly an important part of the year. But if you look back and think and look at the donor's history, for many donors, their first gift did not come in the first quarter of the year. Yet, for some reason, they get pushed further and further in the year, making our year end even more stressful because we have to secure all those gifts in order to reach our budget. So by sort of front-ending our planning, hopefully we can begin cultivating and get a great head start on the year, cultivating and soliciting these donors so that we can even out revenue, but also that we can think about not just giving them all this love in the last quarter of the year.
And it's a funny thing, the way the calendar is with folks. And we know that holidays can be meaningful. We know that the start of the school year can be meaningful in some organizations with respect to their mission. Thanksgiving is very important. It doesn't have quite the chaos as at the end of the year,
Right.
but it is a time where people think differently. People think differently at the end of the year, but suddenly when it's the first of the year, they think very differently again. You want to comment on that? How do you think, what is the magic about January 1st? Is it a clean slate? Are people thinking, okay, what do I want to accomplish this year? And what are the good groups that I'm supporting? What do they want to accomplish?
Right. I think well, especially this year, of course, we're going to have the election. We're going to get over that hangover. And then I think that also gives some people some time to reflect. But I think it's just one of those natural cyclical things. It's sort of like turn the page, perhaps resolutions, but also a lot of groups deal with a lot of business owners who are mapping out their plan for the year, their business plans for the year. So it's a great opportunity for organizations to also be communicating to donors about their planning and for nonprofits to plan themselves.
Well, I know you suggest sort of thinking through this in three categories. It's not a one size fits all. You start with data. How should we be considering data with respect to the first of the year fundraising strategies?
Well, this is a good time to think about data both in terms of your fundraising strategies and the impact your organization's having. So one of the things we want to be able to look at first thing of the year is really what worked well and maybe some things that didn't work so well. And that would start certainly with our acquisition efforts. You've had some great speakers talking about digital acquisition, direct mail, however you acquire donors. Maybe it's referrals from other donors or board members, but how well are those acquisition methods working? What's the cost to acquire a donor? And then hand in hand with acquisition comes retention. How well are you retaining donors? And you've shared many times the statistics of the percentage of new donors who actually make a second gift is very, very low. So that begs the question of, are we doing our stewardship piece as well so we can retain these donors? So first thing you want to be thinking about is retention. An easy way to think of retention just broadly is saying how many donors gave in 2023 divided by the donors who gave in 2022. That would give you your broad retention rate. But I would suggest you'd want to get a little bit more specific and look at three segments: your new donors, your loyal donors who are not major donors, and then finally your major donors, because all of those would have a slightly different retention rate. But you want to be on top of that. And then the final part, as I said, is the programmatic aspects. Talk to your program staff now to see what they're gathering that we can then convey back to donors in terms of impact for the year.
All right, very good. Well, let me ask you another question related to that in terms of the data. So we know that people who've given recently, this is somewhat counterintuitive, but the people who've given recently are the most likely to give again. Is it worth segmenting our file in different ways? For example, is it worth trying to understand, are there patterns where some of our donors just always give the first 3 months of the year? And should we treat them differently than those who may give in the last month of the year? Those who are new, you said loyal donors. What about also those who haven't given in a while? Should we have a different message to them? You may want to get into that in one of your other buckets, but how do you think through that?
Well, this really does come to understanding your donor file. So definitely looking at it. Sometimes I see organizations that have loyal donors, and what sometimes we call them reflex donors. They tend to give when they get an appeal, and they give frequently, but they say, well, we don't want to send something because we just sent something in November. We want to hold off. Well, no, these donors they are responsive, so we want to think about them and get them an appeal and a relevant appeal, certainly as soon as possible. And thinking about looking also at your file of donors who have jumped in their giving, that have jumped up and they've given a much bigger gift. These are people we want to begin to look at differently to say, are these people potential for major gifts or some other special attention? Because they're showing you by raising their hand financially that they can do more. But I think also the beginning of the year is an important time to go after any donor who lapsed off, who did not give, which would be in 2024. And I always remember Karsten Walter at the Heritage Foundation would say, January, it's time to send out the waifu. And I was like, what's the waifu? And he said, it's the why have you forsaken us letter. So it's it can be a really impactful letter outlining your plans, but also trying to re-engage. You don't want to begin focusing on lapsed donors in June. You want to get them back on board as soon as possible.
Excellent. Well, I want to invite our listeners to jump into the Q&A or the chat. I'll be monitoring that and glad to ask questions of Ann. But Ann, you also mentioned first data. The next bucket I think you'd mentioned to me was distinction. How do you stand out in a crowded marketplace? You mentioned turning to your program staff to say, okay, what is it we can say that we're going to do in this new year? Tell us a little bit more about your thoughts there.
Well, two big things. One is, I think it's very important for organizations once a year to do a competitive analysis. I hear from groups often who say, or they might be a newer group, they might be around, they're saying, well, we do this and nobody else does it. And meanwhile, I'm thinking, yeah, I know 10 other groups who are doing that. So sometimes we haven't really looked at the landscape. And these are all our frenemies. We're not diminishing any of the other organizations. We're just trying to understand where we fit and what's our comparative advantage. So doing a bit of a comparative analysis of looking at these other organizations, saying what exactly are they doing and saying, and how do we fit into that becomes important. But the other part of is your big message. We have a tendency, lots of organizations, we have a tendency to talk about what we're doing before we describe why it's important. So think about what is one of the biggest problems facing our country today, and why is your organization uniquely positioned to solve that problem? You need to present what is the problem or the need or the opportunity, and how you can be part of that solution to donors.
Great. You make a great point. Sometimes we tend to say our donors or my donors do this or that. And the donors don't think of themselves as your donors necessarily. In fact, what we do know, and please comment on this, most people who are philanthropic, who are charitable in their giving, give to 25, 30, 40 or more organizations. And
Right.
so you're one of many, and it's not only a question of how do you stand out, but how are you viewed favorably or unfavorably, even in that mix? Any comment there?
Right. I think you have to, this is part of talking to your donors as much as you can. I mean, certainly there's lots of donors, if depending on the size of your file, you may not have a lot of personal interaction with, but I think you have to help make that distinction to them in a variety of forms. And don't hesitate to repeat the message. I think we think every communication to a donor has to be absolutely unique, when in reality, they haven't even absorbed our last message. So that repetition of message, when you get to a donor and start talking to a donor and they understand what you do and they can say it and they're accurate, you've had success with communicating your message.
Well said. And you are absolutely right. And there's that old expression, it wears out in the boardroom long before it does on the showroom floor. That is to say, we get used to hearing these things as if the donor is just hinging on every word that we're saying and every communication that we send.
That's
Goodness
right.
knows how many emails were deleted or how many letters were never opened or whatever else it might be. Thanks for sharing that. All right, well, let's go into the third bucket of the donors themselves and how you think we should think about them. I appreciate that you categorize the data in one way in terms of segmentation, the distinction in terms of how we differentiate ourselves or stand out, or how Seth Godin talks about being that purple cow. But how do you think we should think about the donors?
Well, I think, we've talked about this before, but I really do think that really adopting this attitude of gratitude within the organization and being able to convey this to donors in a way that shows authentic appreciation for their gifts and the willingness to engage with them for the long haul. I think so many times we're rightly so focused on acquisition, but we wouldn't have to do so much acquisition if we did retention better. And what sometimes we have, if you look at how a development department invests in fundraising resources, there's usually a lot for acquisition. But then when it comes to retention or that stewardship part, it's part of a few people's jobs. Anyone from the person who's sending out the thank you letter to the major gift officer who might be more focused on acquisition. So we really have to flip that on its head a little bit and think about what dollars are we investing in retention? And I think that would actually end up, for many organizations, tremendously changing the value of their house file. In fact, factoid, if you just increase your retention rate by 10%, you'll double the value of your house file. So the lifetime value of your house file. So definitely think about that retention piece and that stewardship piece.
Well, let's talk a little bit about stewardship. And one of the questions that's in the chat is, when is a good time to send a quote unquote stewardship letter where it may be a softer ask? Do you do that at the end of the year, the beginning of the year? I wonder if it might be helpful to sort of walk through where we are. It's the end of October, as you say. Election Day is 2 weeks from today when we're doing this particular
Yeah.
webinar. There's a lot of focus on that. That's a crowded marketplace. We'll think that people will think differently after the election, I guess, depending on how clear those results are known. But then it's Thanksgiving. And as we say, it's a time of gratitude. And then you have the holidays. You have various faith-related holidays, certainly Christmas and Hanukkah. People are thinking about things, the end of the year, beginning of the year. Walk us through how you think people or donors are thinking and how we might maybe modify our message a little bit. Is it more about gratitude tied to Thanksgiving? Does it matter? Or should we just be thinking about gratitude anytime? Give us some thoughts there.
Well, I think we want to be grateful all year. Sometimes I've said sometimes it's fundraising feast or famine. Either we totally ignore our donors or we're bombarding them with thanks. So I would work out your calendar of communications for the year and figure out where you can insert elements of gratitude. Certainly any newsletter or other communication you're sending, weaving in that thank you, weaving in that impact. But I think Thanksgiving's a great holiday because it's not religious. It's truly an American holiday. So that is a wonderful time, I think, to just express gratitude, whether that could be a letter on behalf of the Board of Trustees, recognizing the donor's support over time, or recognizing another milestone. Thanksgiving is, I think, the ideal time. You get into the holidays further into the end of the year, and I think the attention span of donors might be a little bit diminished.
You mentioned a calendar. Tell us a little bit more. What do you recommend to your clients that they think about in terms of a calendar? Do you recommend that you essentially think of beginning with January, the 12 months of the year, how you'll be scheduling donor communications, newsletters, thank yous,
Yeah,
stewardship
absolutely.
reports, solicitations? Tell us more.
Well, I always start out with a calendar. Sometimes I just do it in Excel, but month to month, and begin with thinking about what is going on in the world that as it impacts our donors. So we want to be relevant all the time. And there are key things that are happening throughout the year. Maybe it's if you're working in the tax space, certainly April's a big tax month, but there's many other things. So think about that big picture of what might be happening in the world that we can clue into that's going to make our work even more relevant to our donors. Then I think about, in the next line, in the next row, if you're using Excel, I might put in what are the events that our own organization is doing. So we're clued into that. So we're thinking about the times we might be asking them to come to an event, or we might be doing some specific initiative. And then I would have another line saying, what are some other events that are also related to our space and where we work? Then from there, I would just break it down by our segments. What am I going to be doing with each segment each month? Now, not every single month, perhaps you might be doing something, but if you start by slotting in the elements of when you're going to be cultivating or showing gratitude or communicating, and then when you're going to be slotting in those solicitations and appeals, you have a pretty robust calendar. Things always change, of course, but if you map out a lot of it, it makes it a lot easier going into the 2025.
So your point on the calendar is, even if it's a pretty simple calendar, it at least helps you get ahead, think more thoughtfully, strategically, rather than scrambling to try to solve the crisis of the day or to try to do whatever you're trying to do just this week to get by.
Absolutely. I mean, the thing is, as you're doing a competitive analysis of your space, you might also want to do a bit of a communications audit and take a look at what, pull it all together. What are all the communications you sent to your donors last year or this past year? And what's the story you think it told? Did it sound like a jumbled, whole bunch of different messages, or was it really a conversation that had continuity through the year? And that's what you're looking for. So consider, what is the messaging journey you want to take your donors on in 2025?
Well, that's a great way to look at it. Thank you. So I'm going to ask you a little bit of a different question, Ann, and that is sort of fundraising do's and don'ts. First, I guess, what do you think is the most common mistake that nonprofits make in the fundraising space, maybe in the category of missed opportunities, either overt mistake or not taking advantage of an opportunity right in front of them?
Well, I think the biggest thing I see is actually whale watching, where they have identified a donor, not their own donor, but some other wealthy philanthropist who they have no connection to. And they decide that's the person that they want to focus in on, even though they have no strategy or way to approach it. Maybe if they did, fine, I would say go right ahead. But instead of looking at their own list and focusing on donors they already have and how to cultivate them, they're sort of going after these other donors who are pretty much not prospects, or certainly very cool prospects. So I think that's one thing. The other thing is just I would say a little bit of inertia, getting off to a slow start. Like of course now that we have lots of tips to get off to a fast start, but getting off to a slow start in January, and then you almost are always trying to catch up, and you're missing out on opportunities because you really haven't come up with thoughtful cultivation strategies for your donors. So I think it's absolutely critical to have a planning session in January. That's something you can do now. Get it on your calendar for January. It could be a day or a few days where you can discuss each of your major donors or prospective major donors and think about the cultivation steps that will get them more engaged and ultimately ready for a more significant ask. And then again, the last part is just data. I always say, in January, we need to lose our gut, sometimes literally because we've had so much eggnog, but we need to lose our gut instincts because sometimes that's leading us down the wrong path. We need to look at our data and understand what's really working. And for example, some organizations will do events and they'll say, this event is just fantastic. But if you look at the data, are you really netting money? Are you missing out on other opportunities because all the staff is involved in this event? And are you succeeding in getting behavior change from donors? Are they just event attendees, or are you actually able to cultivate major donors from this event? As they say, if it don't make dollars, it don't make sense. So just think about that in terms of collecting data and using that well.
Well, these are some terrific insights, Anne, and I want to welcome folks again. If you want to ask a question, go ahead and put it in the chat or the Q&A. You touched on two very important things. One is that don't go with your gut, and you're right. So much of fundraising technology is actually counterintuitive. What we would think would work doesn't, and what we would think wouldn't work often does. And to your point about the whale watching, president of an organization, this person many years ago, called me late on a Friday night because he had this epiphany. And he said, you know what, we're doing fundraising all wrong. We're wasting our time on all these donors. We should just be focusing on the billionaires. Let's just go after the Forbes 400 list. And, my thought was, well, gee, nobody's ever thought of that before. Comment if you would, Anne, because this relates a lot to your background. Why is cultivation of your current donors, your existing donors, your loyal donors, as you said, so important?
Well, they're already connected. They already share in your mission. They already want to be part of this. So to ignore them or not put in the spade work to really develop that relationship. So certainly there's lots of tools out there like wealth screening that can help identify folks who have the capacity, but don't forget about plan giving. A lot of donors, their deep assets are not just in cash. They're in real estate or retirement plans or their wills or estates or whatever. So I think we miss out on a lot by not thinking about these donors first before we start looking at, this shiny object that's way out there that we can't attain. So beginning to look at these donors by building that stronger donor connections, we'll also have more donors for any kind of campaign or any other plan giving program we're going to run. So focus in on those. Make sure you are maximizing your own list while considering other prospects, but first think, do you have a connection? Do you have linkage to that prospective donor?
What a great point. And, we featured the Leadership Institute many times on these webinars and fundraising tips because they do so much stuff internally and they've
Mhm.
built over the long haul. They have such a dedicated strategy. It was just pointed out to me yesterday that over the last 40 years, they've invested $30 million in prospecting, and
Wow.
those donors have subsequently given well over $300 million. So, what an
Yeah,
extraordinary way to
absolutely.
demonstrate the power of what you said. And a lot of those were plan giving donors who, after a long period of time, left the Leadership Institute and their will. And then we also know the Heritage Foundation story that John Von Cannon used to talk about. 85% of their major donors started as direct mail donors at $100 or less, which is extraordinary. And for the benefit of folks here, tell us a little bit about how you got involved in fundraising, what you did, and then how you decided to start your own firm. And give us a little
Mhm.
plug for AC Fitzgerald.
Oh, well, thank you so much. We focus on strategic counsel and communications. Though I was working at the Heritage Foundation for a number of years under John Von Cannon, who was just a wonderful fundraiser. Certainly learned a lot. The way my background was in sales and marketing. My first job in fundraising was at Heritage as director of development. I was completely unqualified for the job. So, but I learned quickly, I hope. And then, but it was 18 years ago that I realized there were a lot of organizations out there that also felt that they wanted to grow and they wanted to grow like Heritage, but they just weren't exactly sure how. So our philosophy has always been the principles of fundraising are the same, but how we apply them is going to be different based on the organization. So different organizations are going to have different fundraising strategies. So for the last 18 years, we've worked with 200 plus organizations and very excited to see many of them have just really taken off and grown. And we're always excited to be part of that.
Well, thank you for your service to our shared principles in that manner. 200 organizations and those that have really taken off is an extraordinary accomplishment. As we wrap up, Ann, what is your parting advice to those who are listening today? You've been at this for a good long time. You have a lot of experience, a lot of achievement. If there was one really important thing you wanted folks to be left with, what would it be?
Well, the advice I give is not my own. It's from John Von Cannon, the late John Von Cannon. He always said, you can get an A in fundraising, but you can't get 100%, meaning there's always more to do. But the successful fundraisers are able to discern what has the greatest value, which donors they should be focusing on, what strategies they should be focusing on, how can they be successful as an organization. And that goes to having that strong plan going into January, going into the new year.
Well, what a way to wrap up, especially when you quote John Von Cannon. I always like that as well. He was phenomenal. Ann Fitzgerald, it's a pleasure to have you. Ladies and gentlemen, AC Fitzgerald, check it out on the web. I also have had links. I'll send this in the follow-up. She and her team do excellent work if you're looking for some support along the way, particularly as you launch into 2025. Thanks. We'll be back to you next week. We'll have Peter Lipset telling us about donor advised funds. What are they and how are they so important to powering our long-term growth? They're an important partnership in so many of our work. All right. Thank you so much. All the best to you. We'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Kevin.